Thank you very much for those kind words, and I want to tell you what a pleasure it is to have been invited to speak to fellow members. I'm sorry I missed the last one. I was out of the country teaching in Morocco, but I'd like to pick up where our excellent talk from Jamie Hammond left off 2 talks ago. He gave us an excellent lecture on Afghanistan, and we sort of ended the discussion on that talk discussing professional military education for military officers. Now, the Canadian military, like all modern militaries, claims to be a profession, and as a profession, it has its own standards and professional military education. But the reality is, if doctors and lawyers were trained in their profession the way we train our leaders in our profession, we would still be living in anarchy and casting spells to get rid of disease. We neglect the study of war until far too late in a leader's career, and the vast majority of majors in the military may have heard of Clausewitz or Jomini, but they haven't read it. They haven't read what those people wrote. The same is true of majors in the Air Force who haven't read Douay, and lieutenant commanders in the Navy who haven't read Mahan. John Adams was America's 2nd president, and he said that he needed to study war so that his sons would have the liberty to study architecture, commerce, agriculture, and in order that their children could then study painting, poetry, music, and porcelain. That was 2 centuries ago, and we're not there yet. So, I'm going to talk to you briefly about my book. I'm going to use the book as the basis for the talk, and here is the aim of the talk. I normally tend to wander when I speak. I've been asked to stay relatively close to the microphone because it's being recorded, so I'm sorry to put the lectern between us, but I will stay close so that the microphone can pick up the recording so that we can post this, I guess, later. So the aim is just to pique your interest. I don't intend to try and teach you anything. You probably will teach me something by the end of the lecture. So I'm proud to tell you that here's the content of the book, and at least one of you has told me that they've begun to read it. And I'm proud to tell you that this book has been taken as a textbook at the United States National War College for this semester, and that Norwich University Grad School uses it as a textbook, and that the United States Marine Corps is in negotiation with my publisher right now to use it in their advanced warfighting series and possibly at the Marine Corps University. Interestingly, no Canadian schools have shown any interest at all. I'm sure that there's more than just me here who knows our current chief. I have a lot of respect for General Eyre, and he's doing a heck of a job under some very trying circumstances, not least of which his boss. But this quote, which I took from the National Post, October the 6th, is indicative of some of the problems that we have. Wayne is a very bright, very well-educated guy who's a supreme soldier. And for him to say that verges on the idiotic. We are not at war with Russia. We are not at war with China. We use that word wrongly, okay? And part of the problem is we use that word so often that it's become, we're deaf to what it means. We've been at war with poverty for decades. Doctors are at war with cancer. What the heck does that mean? Right? Dentists are at war with cavities. The word has lost its meaning. The word war has a meaning, and I talk about this in the book at depth. But basically what it means is sloppy language equals sloppy thinking equals poor communications. It's that simple, right? Most of you in the crowd have been leaders, whether it's been in business or in the military or in academia, and you know what I mean. When you use language improperly, you end up with poor communications and poor thinking skills. And that's where we are. So, I am going to do a straw poll. Spelling doesn't count, and your grade won't matter at the end of the lunch. So, in my book, in the model that I create, and I'll show you that in a moment, I break down military thinking into three aspects: philosophers, strategists, and theorists. So, most of you have heard of General Klaus von Clausewitz, Prussian general. All right. By show of hands, was Clausewitz a philosopher? If you think so, put your hand up. Thank you. Was he a theorist? Put your hand up. Equal. Was he a strategist? Put your hand up. Okay. Sun-Tzu. Just what everybody's heard of General Sun-Tzu, 2,500 years ago, general in China. Was Sun-Tzu a philosopher? Hands up. Was Sun-Tzu... You're cheating. You've read the book already. Was he a theorist? Or was he a strategist? Okay. Last one. Napoleon. Philosopher? Oh, interesting. Theorist? Strategist. Hey, we're making progress. So, Clausewitz was not a philosopher. He was not a strategist. He was a theorist. He wrote a theory, and it's in his book on war, which, if you've tried to read it and failed, you're in good company, because only book 1 of 8 books in the book, chapter 1, was edited. He died before he finished. Okay? So there's a lot of internal inconsistencies, but actually most of what we think about war today is based on that book. Sun Tzu, a philosopher of war. He wrote a philosophy. His book's only 100 pages long. Okay? He didn't give us any theories, and he didn't give us any strategies. You can infer strategies from what he wrote, but he didn't give us a strategy. And Napoleon, as you correctly said, most of you, was a strategist. He never wrote a theory, and he wasn't a philosopher. Right? He was a practitioner. He was a strategist, and obviously very good at it. So what's the premise of the book? Well, the premise is that after 2,500 years of study, starting with Sun Tzu, moving to the present, we still know less than we think we know. And that's what I argue in the book, that we don't really know what we think we know about the nature of war. We know a lot about the nature of warfare, and warfare changes every day. Right? But we too often confuse war with warfare. Warfare is how we fight, and we change the way we fight with every battle. War is that concept which is really a political construct. The historian Dr. Howard, British, he defined war as conflict of two societies. When two societies fight each other, that's what war is. Right? Clausewitz gave us an interesting quote in his book. He says that war has its own lexicon, but not its own grammar. In other words, it has its own language, but how that language is constructed and why it's constructed that way is not military. It's political. We all know that famous quote that it's the extension of politics by other means, right? So this book is based on a rewrite, a 6-year rewrite of my doctoral thesis. And I rewrote it so that it would be more legible to a broader audience, a non-academic audience. And I wrote it as a primer, or a primer, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which introduces these subjects to people and I draw some conclusions at the end, but the conclusions I can tell you right now. We don't know what we think we know. The rest of it is hoping to give the reader an inclination to read more. So you've heard about this guy Clausewitz, but you went to the library and you looked at the book and it's 800 pages translated from the German. If you think it's bad in English, I read it in German. I mean, it's even worse in German. There are sentences that are 2 pages long. Right? So the aim of the book is to introduce you to these ideas and to hope that I'll whet your appetite and that you'll then begin to get a better understanding of war on land, war at sea, war in the air, the future of war and warfare, and how things are changing. And before I go any further, just let me say that we will have time at the end for discussion, but I'm very comfortable if at any time I say something that sits with you or you need an explanation. Please just raise your hand. I'll stop talking and I'll answer your question. Feel free. I won't be upset. Interrupt me anytime. I'm a cavalry officer. My flow of thinking is erratic, even if I'm reading from notes, so you won't upset me. Ask Cam. So, let's start looking at some of the diagrams. You won't have seen this anywhere else because this is my model. I didn't take it from anywhere. And what does it try to tell you? This is the most important diagram or model in the book. And what it's telling you is that based on my study and my premise, that the basis for all military theory and thinking is philosophy. Okay? And I'll come back to this. Upon philosophies, we build theories. And this goes not just for the military, but for just about anything we do as human beings. Theories then spawn policies. We tend to think of policies as government policies, but corporations have policies, armies have policies, navies have policies. From those policies that have been born of theories and philosophies, strategies are created. And then strategies spawn campaign plans, and then campaign plans use tactics, techniques, and procedures. For the non-army people, that's what TTPs are. Tactics, techniques, and procedures. And in fact, in my previous book, I spend a lot of time talking about how TTPs should never be mentioned together because they're completely separate. And then here I am putting them together, but we use TTPs as a term so frequently that it's just easier to talk about them as a group. But tactics, techniques, and procedures are independent of each other. So, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the intellectual model that says that war is fought at 3 levels. The lowest being the tactical level, above it the operational level, which is relatively new. It was only introduced into our thinking by the Germans in the 19th century, and most of you are old enough, if you read the Canadian Army Journal or its predecessor or the Canadian Defense Quarterly, you might remember that a certain Captain Oliviero argued in multiple issues with a certain Captain Roman Yeromowitz. God rest his soul. Roman was a Royal Canadian Hussar and a great cartoonist. And Roman and I fought in print over and over and over because Roman kept telling me that I had my head up my butt, that it wasn't the Germans, it was the Russians. But in fact, Roman was wrong. Sorry, buddy, you were wrong. It was the Germans, and the Russians took that thinking because Clausewitz, most people don't know, became a Russian staff officer after Napoleon defeated the Prussians in 1806. He fought for the Tsar, and they adopted his thinking and his writing. And the Russians in the 19th and early 20th century expanded the concepts of operational art, but it is a German concept. And then it came into NATO round about the late 70s, early 80s. The Americans adopted it as their own, and now they claim that They are the masters of operational art. That remains to be seen. The next level is strategic level. And we see all kinds of modifiers, geostrategic, political strategic. It's hogwash, it's eyewash. Strategic. It's either strategic or it's not. Okay? And I always encourage my students in the 2 decades that I've been teaching this now to consider, I'm not saying that it's there, but I want them to consider a 4th level. And that is the theoretical level of war. What does it mean to have a theoretical construct for war and warfare? And again, I'll come back to this idea later on as well. So, in my book, I talk almost exclusively about the large oval at the top, war-centered military theory. When I started looking into this 1,000 years ago, I spent days in the stacks of big libraries, Queen's, RMC, the Army Staff College, the National Archives, only to discover that there was very little written on war-centered military theory, that most of it was actually either power-centered, which is actually a political theory of military theory, force-centered, which is different than power-centered, national security theories, which again is political, and then separate from those, the ancient theories, which were mythological or theological. The gods sent us to war. The gods controlled our lives. I'm sorry, I meant to turn that off. So I talk about war-centered theory. When you go to a civilian university and talk about military theory, they immediately think you're talking about conflict studies. No, I'm not talking about conflict studies. I don't care if we give each other a hug. I'm talking about what's going on right now in Ukraine. Right. That's war-centered military theory. And that's mostly what I talk about. So here's another diagram from the book, just to help the reader, especially if they're not military, to understand that war and warfare are both art and science. And that at the low level, it's more science than it is art. So if you're a platoon commander or a section commander, or even a company commander, or a battalion commander, or if you're commanding a single ship, then mostly it's about science. It's about the weapons that you're using, it's about you understanding ballistics, it's about use of ground, that sort of thing. And as you rise to command more and more troops and move through the operational art into strategic, then it becomes more of an art and less of a science, because you have to concern yourself with so many influences that have nothing to do with the mechanics of the fighting. Political interference, political objectives, national policies, humanities and laws of war, all of those things that the low-level commander doesn't have to concern himself with. The low-level commander, she's fighting a tank squadron and she's worried about engaging that tank squadron. She's not worried about, operational art. That's way above her thinking, at least for the time being. And then as you move across the spectrum, you go back to the basis of philosophy upon which we have theory, upon which we build our strategies, and if you keep moving to the right, you end up with the actual conduct of the conflict. So, does that show up well? So here is a further explanation of using my model and the previous models that I showed you. So if we take out the war-centered military theory from the previous diagram and disregard the rest, within that diagram, then each country has its own military theory. And within each country's military theory, that pyramid that starts at philosophy and moves upwards towards tactics applies. And it's different in every culture. It's different in every country. If any of you have ever been either on a multinational military exercise or been an exchange officer with another Army, Navy, or Air Force, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Things that we take for granted, other countries disregard. Things that they take for granted, we don't care about. My premise is that's because every country bases its culture on a different philosophy. And the problem that we have in NATO, and many of you have served in NATO or served with NATO, NATO's got, what, how many countries now? 31? 30? And so you've got 30 countries, and there is such a thing as NATO doctrine, and every country tries very hard to amalgamate its doctrine, military doctrine, Army, Navy, Air Force, Joint Forces, into NATO doctrine. But the underlying philosophy that created the French Republic is a different underlying philosophy than what created Great Britain, than what created Italy or Turkey. So with different foundation stones, they end up, the next step, right, which is theories, they end up with different theories. A perfect example of where this comes into conflict is the United States. So the United States has a national philosophy, right? The freedom of man. But when they move up into theory, for over 150 years, they were Jominian, clearly based on Jomini. Jomini was the only theorist taught at the United States Military Academy at West Point. And then in the 1970s, they discovered Clausewitz. And now every manual has a quote from Clausewitz. But Jomini gave us the principles of war. I mean, they were codified by the Brits. The current 10 principles that we claim to use were actually codified by a Brit Major General, an armored officer, Fuller. Right? And the Americans have 10, but they're not the same as our 10. The French have 3. The Russians have 12. So I start to ask myself, if they're principles, how can they be different? Electricity flows the same here as it does in Washington, as it does in Saskatchewan. It flows differently in Great Britain. If you've ever studied electronics, you know that it flows in the opposite direction in Great Britain. But that's a mathematical tweak. But you see, so the American military has this built-in tension because they are combining the theories of 2 of the great land theorists, Clausewitz and Jomini, and they don't agree with each other. Jomini says there are 10 principles. Clausewitz says there are no principles. How do you rationalize this? The Americans rationalize it by ignoring it. And as I can't speak to the Canadian Navy or the Canadian Air Force, although they have strongly now both done what the Canadian Army has done and have moved into accepting American doctrine as our own in many, many cases by simply lifting their doctrine and dumping it into ours without studying why we've done it or what it means to us. So I'm going to give you a second. I think that's reasonably legible. When the gunner's lips have stopped moving, So General Ryan makes my point for me, and he wrote this less than a month ago. Right? The Ukrainians are eating the Russians' lunch for a very simple reason. The Ukrainian senior officers studied Russian doctrine. They had to. Ukrainian generals were all young officers when they belonged to the Soviet Union, and they had Russian doctrine fed to them. And they know how the Russians are going to fight, and they're using their doctrine against them. Apart from the fact that the Ukrainians have a totally different command and control structure, which I address in my next book about independent thinking and leadership. But that's why we need to study military theory. It's not as arcane as some people think. It's important specifically for leaders, and not just military leaders, but people who are given charge of departments of national defense or entire countries. Most of us have seen this quote before. So what happens when you don't prepare yourself? Well, they become the teacher, you become the student. The Russians are currently the students. Personally, I don't think they'll ever become the teachers because their military doctrine is deeply flawed. Right? Thank goodness. But that's why we need to study this, and we need to study it long before they get to be, our leaders, especially in this country, get to be colonels and are sent on a one-year course in Toronto where they get to look at this. This needs to be looked at least initially when they enter the military, when they're told they're going to become a leader. There's no reason that you cannot start teaching this to non-commissioned officers. It's not rocket science. If it were, it wouldn't be military. Right? It's simple stuff, but you need to understand how it all fits. So, I've been talking mostly about Army stuff, so let me just take a break here. Do we have retired naval people in the crowd? Okay, so you're in the minority, sorry. Like reality. So, my book talks about war on land, which is the biggest chapter, war at sea, and war in the air. So when I talk about war at sea, these are the three main themes, right? La Jeune École, and most of you probably have never heard of it. The French aren't keen to dredge this up again because it was a disaster for them. And this is something that we can talk about later. What happens when you have too much belief in technology and not enough belief in moral leadership and trusting your senior officers? It destroyed the Navy. It ended in 1905 when they reinstituted their shipbuilding program, but they couldn't catch up. They weren't ready to fight until the Second World War. And we all know what happened to the French Navy in the Second World War. Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American, he basically took Jomini, which his father, who was a captain in the engineers, taught at West Point for 40 years. Both sides of the U.S. Civil War, every general officer on both sides of the U.S. Civil War was a student of Alfred's father. Okay? And it's all based on Jomini. And then along comes Corbett, who's a historian, not a sailor, and he comes up with his own theory of naval warfare, which is actually based on Clausewitz. And every blue water navy in the world, including the Royal Canadian Navy, still thinks in terms of Alfred Thayer Mahan. Blue water, or what was called guerre d'escadre, squadron warfare. Fleet engagements. You've got to destroy the enemy's fleet. But at the same time, we are now all moving towards joint operations. What the United States Marine Corps started talking about when they talked about littoral operations, offshore operations, sending troops ashore. And the U.S. Navy is moving strongly towards littoral operations and joint forces, as are we. And that's based on Julian Corbett. They don't agree. They don't disagree completely, but they don't agree. So you have to find a way to cut the baby in half. And the only way to do that is to study both and then come up with a synthesis of what it is that you think you can do to bring these two great theories together. Because it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's a question of there's applicability here and there's not there, but there is applicability here in the other theory and not there. And we don't yet have a unified theory, just like we don't have a unified theory of physics. Right? Max Planck came up with his theory, Albert Einstein came up with his theory, and at a certain point, they disagree completely. How can that be? We see similar things when we talk about military theory. In the air warfare chapter, I talk about three of the most important guys. John Boyd, and some of you may be familiar with this, called the OODA loop, or the Boyd cycle. So Boyd was a fighter pilot in the US Air Force, and he one day wondered, why were the casualties in North Korea of the North Korean and Chinese fighter pilots so much higher than our fighter pilots? Their planes were more or less comparable. We flew Sabres and Super Sabres. They flew MiG whatevers, I don't know, 17s? 15s? The planes were comparable, and yet their loss ratio to our loss ratio was 10 to 1. So our pilots were better, clearly, but more importantly, our fighters used a different thinking process. Their fighters were all controlled, and to this day, Russian fighters are still controlled from a central source. They don't think for themselves. Our fighter pilots did this. This is what he came up with. They observed. They immediately oriented their aircraft, made a decision, and put that decision into action. And as soon as they put that decision into action, they immediately re-observed and reoriented, and they created this loop. And the idea was, the way he put it was, you had to get inside the enemy's decision cycle. And by the time you moved inside the cycle, the enemy realized there was no way out. Some of them crashed, some of them were just shot down because they couldn't react fast enough to what you were doing. Now, we have taken this theory, which is an excellent one, and it is now NATO doctrine, not just for air power, but it is NATO doctrine for decision making. Army, Navy, Air Force, Joint Forces. We've turned this into something that in our doctrine we call the decision-making cycle. And he didn't come up with this until about 20 years ago. So it's relatively new, but it's a good way of explaining how leaders make decisions and then how those decisions are forced upon the enemy. One of his acolytes, I'll call him, one of his subordinates, he was a mentor to a guy called John Warden, another Air Force colonel. John Warden was one of these hotshots who he wrote the air campaign plan for the Gulf War. And he's still alive. He came up with this theory, which I got into an interesting argument with a pilot about, well, actually while I was in Morocco teaching, because whenever I see the 5-ring model, that old expression, don't eat that, Elmer, it's horseshit. It makes sense when you look at it and say, okay, well, the inner ring, the leadership ring, right, is critical. The next one is the systems, then the infrastructure, population, and the fielded military. And what you really want to do with your air power, strategic air power, because remember, air power is broken into tactical air power and strategic air power, fighters and bombers, to be simplistic, is, you're wasting your efforts if you're constantly fighting the fielded military. What you really want to do is you want to focus on the leadership, right? Which is what the Americans tried to do when they went into Iraq, and they got rid of all of the command posts, they struck all of the antenna farms, they got rid of all the communication systems, so that the ground forces would be left leaderless. So it seems to be a good theory, but it tends to break down in practice. And unfortunately, what this led to was something called effects-based operations, which was an American Air Force design, which was then adopted by the American military and the Joint Forces, and then within 3 or 4 years, it was not only abandoned, it was outlawed. And as far as I can tell, the only place that it's still taught is at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto. Yes, question. Frank. Observation, orientation, decision, action. Okay. So I showed you this model earlier, right? My proprietary pyramid. I'm just going to need to get... Yes?
I'm just wondering if that's so similar to Deming's theory, plan, do, check, act. Is that comparison wrong, like in business?
Yeah, some people have suggested that it's related, but I don't believe he knew Deming when he came up with his own theory. I think it's one of those interesting coincidences which tells us how our brain works rather than where they got it. Because our brain tends to work that way, right? That you have to see something in order to orient, to then make a decision, and then act, right? And the importance of the OODA loop is how quickly you can push yourself through it. Because if you take forever, you're going to run out of time. That's the key. Not the steps. It's the key is how quickly you can do it. So, when I built this model, it was an attempt to get people who were trying to understand what I was saying into a certain mind frame, but it's clearly simplistic, all right? So then I thought to myself, okay, this is a Rubik's Cube, and if for those of you that can't see it, you know, each of the surfaces, different colors, has a word on it, and you know, so it's the words from this model. So it's tactics, or strategy, or philosophy, or policy, and of course, as the fighting or the war goes on, the Rubik's Cube is constantly moving. And so the relationship between tactics and strategy, or tactics and policy, doesn't last. It moves, it changes. And I thought, well, that might be a better way to get people to understand how important it is to understand the linkages, the relationships. And then I thought, well, maybe that's too rigid. And maybe that's a better model. Okay, so same words as before. Policy, tactics, philosophy, theory, strategy. Now what that is actually is that's a snapshot of a neural network in the brain of a worm. Right? Yeah. Or a gunner, one or the other. I can't remember. But, you know, I would have said cavalry officer, but that's far too many connections. But the point is that there is no direct line that says policy to strategy, strategy to tactics. And even changing those lines isn't a good way to do it. The reality is probably closer to this, which says there are thousands of routes that take you from philosophy to campaigns. Right? And they change constantly as the chemistry changes. As the situation changes, the routes on how to get from one to the other are constantly moving. They're never static. And so I introduced this model near the end of the book because by then either you're interested enough to read on or you've given up. It doesn't really matter. Okay? So, I hope that I've whet your appetite. That was all I wanted to do. I just wanted to drop the pebble in the pond. Okay? And if you want to read more about the way my brain works, or just so that you can write back and say, Chuck, you've got your head up your butt, that's my homepage. And you don't need to write it down. I got a bunch of my cards, which I'll dump on the table. So these are my calling cards, and you know, on that is the web page. And you're welcome to go to the web page and post telling me that I've got it all wrong. I look forward to that. I did not bring any books with me. I was raised in an officer's mess where you weren't allowed to take pictures and you didn't sell stuff. So anyway, I don't have any books. I've got my own copy, and if you want to buy a copy of any of my books, then you go to Amazon. This is the next one, which is currently being, it's through the editing stage. It's just being formatted so that it can be printed, and we hope to release it on the 1st of December, because what's a better stocking stuffer than a book on war? You know, I mean, right? And I've managed to get some interesting old friends to endorse it, and one of them is Lieutenant General retired Sir Bill Rollo, a Brit cavalry officer who's a longtime friend. And you know, his immediate comment was, "Well, Chuck, we beat the Germans twice at their national sport. Why would we want to adopt their leadership style?" I said, "Bill, read the book and then tell me if you still want to say anything on the cover." So that's it, and I'm happy to get questions. Cam.
Chuck, very good presentation. Like others, you probably remember a couple times you were critical of the, and rightly so, of the Canadian system. So I'd like you to spend some time with you in the saddle fixing our system. That we're a small force, 60,000 all up, with the shortages that we have right now. And when one gets posted as, say, the commandant of the staff college, it's likely from in Toronto. You're likely coming from an operational job or whatever, that you have not likely had time to think about things like you have just discussed. And the boss of that college is the commander of CDA, or who was, I presume still is, the Canadian Defence Academy. And likewise, has not had that necessarily, rarely has had an academic time or experience to develop their own ideas or take yours and modify them to the Canadian culture, military culture. You have rightly identified the morphing of U.S. culture into our system, our doctrine, our policies. And I would argue that that's probably because of the considerable number of generals that we have had as deputy commanders of various. Wayne Eyre was deputy commander, 18th Airborne,
Correct,
etc. So can you jump into that saddle and say, with a small 60,000 institution, how do you change to our teachings of our junior officers and our senior NCOs to take us recognizing our changing culture? And we are seeing, the demographics are very indicative of how the gap between Canada, the States, gap between Canada and European countries is changing dramatically and dynamically and in a good mood. You're the boss, how would you change it?
When I came today, I was looking for you, Cam, because I knew if anybody was going to ask a question to make my head hurt, it would be you. But thank you. Actually, you've raised a half a dozen good questions. Let me say a couple things. I agree with you. The Canadian military has moved towards the American model for lots of good reasons, some not so good. Just about all of our senior officers have been integrated into the American system. We send them to their schools, right? How would I do it? Well, the first thing I would do is I would accept the fact that it's easier for us than possibly any army or armed forces in the world. We're tiny, right? So we don't have to change the thinking of 2 million people. We don't have to change the thinking, not even of 60,000. We probably have to change the thinking of, start with the general officers, flag officers. Get them to change their thinking, and then the colonels, and then the lieutenant colonels. And your point is well taken. We used to spend a lot of time in the field, at sea, flying. That's not true anymore. I mean, I think back to my RMC graduation class, and the guys who went off to get their wings in Portage, they probably had more hours by the time I went to my first reunion 5 years after grad than pilots with 35 years service have now. So what are they doing the rest of the time? Well, most of them are working on MBAs, right? Or at least Masters of Military Arts and Science. Well, if we've got time to send them for master's degrees, we've got time to make them read some of this stuff, right? And you don't have to read all of it. You just have to get started. You just have to get your foot in the door and understand that, no. Military theory isn't something you're going to need when you get to be a general officer, so that in the last 6 years of your life, you can talk intelligently at international fora. Military theory is something you need to understand after you get your blanket, your first beret, and your first pair of boots. That there's a reason that Canadians fight this way. I mean, I came from the Navy. When I was at RMC, I was a naval cadet, right? But I was one of those guys that just couldn't keep my food down. I mean, I had the record for it. As soon as we hit the breakwater and Esquimalt, I was sick. Bang, right? So after finishing Mars 2 and Mars 3, I managed to convince somebody, and I'll be honest with you, it was only because my father-in-law was personally connected to the guy who then became Chief of Personnel, Jimmy Quinn. And lo and behold, I ended up in Jimmy Quinn's regiment. Who knew? But I used to ask, because I arrived at the armored school as a commissioned lieutenant and, a little bit more intellectually inclined than the Phase 2 officer cadets, I would ask my NCOs, well, that's interesting. Why do we do that? And the answer was always the same. We've always done it that way, sir. I mean, we would, Cam, you're not that much older than me, just a few years, and you remember, stand-tos. Anybody in the Army remembers stand-tos, right? Half an hour before sunup, everybody was awake and everybody was in their battle position. And I thought, well, I'm a military historian. The reason we started doing this was because the Zulus attacked at dawn. We never stopped. Now, we don't do it now, right? Armies no longer do sun-up stand-tos because it's idiotic, right? We fight around the clock. All it does is deprive your soldiers of sleep. But, you ask the NCOs, oh, we've always done it, sir. Well, yeah, since the Zulu Wars, but we're talking about moving these tanks. Why would we do that? So, I take your point, Cam. It's a good one. How would I do it? That's how I would start. I would start by introducing tidbits of military theory early on, right? And make them understand that when we say that you are joining a profession of arms, we're serious. You need to study this stuff, right? I mean, would you go and have a doctor operate on you if he said to you, well, I just got my doctor's license last week and I never actually studied anything about surgery, but we'll get through this together. Would you lie down, please? I don't think so. Right? I mean, it makes perfect sense at the early stages that we train our leaders, that we train them first to be soldiers. This is how you dig a trench. This is how you tie your boots. This is how you turn a wrench. This is how a tank works. This is how an artillery piece works. But when they graduate, we tend to let them believe that they're done now. You're commissioned. That's it. Good for you. And that's not true. So, I drank the Kool-Aid. 2 years in Hamburg. I didn't realize that I had become a fully fledged Bundeswehr General Staff Officer until it was too late. And I'm there and I can't come back. But what they do, first of all, is they say, we have a limited force. We don't need to train 50% of our officers in the higher levels. And so they make their captains compete. And when I say compete, it's brutal. Lieutenants and captains compete for 18 months to get a spot at their staff college. And they crawl over each other's dead bodies because only 10% of the officers in the Army go to staff college. 10%. Because just like chartered accountants in Canada, there is no pass-fail. It's where did you rank in your studies? And they start at the top and they say, this year we have 46 slots. in Hamburg. And they start at the top and then work their way down. And number 47 never gets to go. He doesn't get to be the bridesmaid and then go next year. You didn't make the cut this year. Your cohort is moving on. You're done now. And so you go to the troops and you work your way up the ranks. And one of the ways they kept hope alive was when they had 3 corps and 12 divisions, one of the division commanders and one of the corps commanders was always what they call Truppenoffizier, a troop officer, someone who didn't go to staff college. But all the other generals all went to staff college. And this is where they learned to think that way, as captains. And then that select group moves on and on and on and on. And they were so confident that they got it right, they don't have a war college. Now that's possibly a failing, and the way they make up for that is, if you're still going to move up, if you're going to become Deputy Commander of NATO or the Inspector General of the Armed Forces, chances are, as a colonel, you went to the Royal College of Defense Studies in London, or you went to a U.S. Army War College, or a U.S. Navy War College, or some war college somewhere to refresh your brain. But more often than not, you went to that place to remind them that what the Germans did was what you hoped to do. Does that answer your question, Ken?
The sort of reference to 30 NATO members. So how do you teach people to deal with an organization, philosophical, organizational, tactical, Tower of Babel?
Yeah, another good question. Well, for starters, you don't dump your worst officers into the NATO headquarters, right? I remember sitting next to General Evraer's wife when I was a CO on an airplane, and she was whining and crying because her husband didn't get picked up as CDS. He was posted to be Canada's NMR to NATO, right? And to this day, and I don't mean to offend anybody that's done a high-level job in NATO, right? We don't send our best to NATO, right? NATO is where we send them because we don't want them back home, right? So if you've got the second or third string in NATO, and to be blunt, every country does the same thing, right? Well, it's sort of the reverse of champagne. You sell, no, it's not the reverse. It's the same as champagne. You talk to people who live in France, and we say, "Whoa, I had this fantastic champagne." That's nothing compared to this. We keep the good stuff. We sell you the cheap stuff, right? We keep the good officers. We don't send them overseas. Now, we have tried to change that policy by sending some of our top flyers to the United States, as Cam mentioned, as deputy commanders of large formations that they would never get a chance to lead in Canada. But what that does to NATO is that it creates an intellectual deficit in NATO. Now that's supposed to be ameliorated by the NATO Defense College, but it's only 6 months. And 9 out of 10 students that go to the NATO Defense College are there because they're getting a 6-month holiday in Rome. So you have to want to be willing to make the change, but before you can be willing to make the change, you've got to recognize that there's a problem, and I'm not sure that anybody in NATO recognizes it. The Germans are more than happy with their doctrine, and they're never going to change it because it's been extremely successful for them. And, there were some internal jokes in the Bundeswehr. The Bundeswehr never lost a war until they got airplanes, and they haven't won one since. The Air Force counters with, we never lost a war until we had tanks, and we haven't won a war since. But they lost the First World War and the Second World War not for military reasons. And so they're quite happy with their doctrine. Right? The Brits have recognized for a long time that they need to modernize their doctrine, and have been working hard at it, at the same time as the government has been cutting and slashing to the point where they're probably less effective now than we are. So how do you keep that alive when all the good guys decide to become bankers in downtown London? The French, I sent a note to my buddies by email this morning. The French just announced that they're rebuilding their armed forces. They're going to spend 7.5% increase this year. They're waking up to the fact that they've let their military linger, dying on the vine too long. The Germans are happy with their doctrine. They're not happy with their training, and they're not happy with their equipment, so they've decided to spend a lot more. Russia woke everybody up, right? The opposite of what he wanted to do. So, but long-winded answer, here's the short answer. You need to recognize the problem. I don't think they do. Stay seated.
In my career, 38 years, 6 of them in the militia, in tanks. One thing that, and I did all this stuff, I went to Army Staff College, I went to Toronto and saw it. But I spent most of my time not thinking of this, or learning this. I spent most of my time worrying about the fact that we had, quote, a 2-bit army on a 10-cent budget. In other words, everything for us was money.
Right.
How do you turn that around for professional officers? Because you'll need that anywhere you ever have mobilization.
Gary, I honestly don't know. I think, I recently wrote a couple of reviews of, I wrote a review of the review of the Arbour report for some friends of mine. And then, I don't know if any of you have read Michel Maisonneuve's article in, it was published in the Vinny Papers. So, and he argues along with a professor, is it Charbonneau? That the Royal Military College needs to return to its roots and become an academy again, a military academy. And so I wrote a review of my classmates' argument, which I think is a solid argument, right?
What was your...
But the problem relates to what you were talking about. And the problem is that in this country, the Department of National Defense has a whiplash. Every time they get a new minister, the minister has a new hobby horse. The current hobby horse seems to be gender integration and getting more people of color into the military. Absolutely wonderful idea. Highly commendable. But that doesn't mean that we have to do that at the expense of our warfighting skills. You can do both. But the current ministry, picking my words, seems to believe that you can't do both at the same time. First, you have to fix the gender gap and the cultural gap, and then we'll worry about warfighting. It might be too late by then, because the Navy can't go to sea. The Army can only field a single battle group. A single battle group. The battle group that we can field to help an ally if the balloon went up tomorrow is smaller than the one I commanded in Germany. Right? I had 3 tank squadrons, 2 infantry companies, a reconnaissance squadron, a recce troop, a full echelon, a dedicated artillery battery, and an air defense troop. And I took them to Fallix. 70 square kilometers of terrain. We can't field something like that now. And I was one of 3 battle groups. So the first step, to answer your question, I believe, is to do what the Australians have done. And the Australians about 20 years ago said in Parliament, listen, the military in this country is too important for us to use it as a political football. So we're going to create a policy, and whatever government comes after the next election, they're not going to change it. And they've kept to that promise. Even though they have governments that succeed each other, that hate each other, they don't mess with national defense policy. Our national defense policy changes every government. How can the military understand what it is they're supposed to do? I don't know. There's a question down there.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to follow up on your comment about the Russian doctrine being flawed. Expand on that a little. Is it a flawed doctrine or the absolutely appalling way that we seem to be implementing it?
Both. Their doctrine is flawed because it has not been modernized since the Soviet era. They've got new equipment, but their doctrine hasn't changed, right? And their leadership theory is so deeply flawed. I mean, they still believe in corporal punishment. I had the eye-opening experience. I was the first commanding officer of the Arms Control Verification Group. I was telling people a story before we came in here on how I got picked by Bob Gaudreau to do that job, or how I got to volunteer to do that job. But so I led the first inspection team into Russia after the Soviet Union started to collapse and the wall came down. And one of the places they took me into a motor rifle division garrison. Hand on heart. The soldiers in the barracks had the same living conditions that we would have found if Napoleon had been there in 1814. It was abysmal. A garrison of an entire division had in the dining hall one toilet. So they just did their business wherever the hell they wanted. Soldiers were routinely beaten. I visited a garrison, wasn't in the garrison, we drove by a garrison in Marienburg, East Germany, after the wall came down. And I had as my Russian translator on the bus. He was German, so he was surprised he didn't need to do any translation. But we drove by this garrison, and the gates were locked. There was a big sign in German telling us which regiment that it was. And behind that I thought they were burnt out factories. The windows were broken, the gates were locked. And I said, what used to be in there? And he said to me, oh, there's a Russian garrison. They're still there. I said, they're still there? He said, yeah, we locked the gates and we've trapped them inside because they haven't been paid in 3 months. And we can't let them out because we're terrified of what they'll do. So we have a 24-hour, the Bundeswehr has a 24-hour security on the garrison to keep them locked in until the Russian transport comes to take them home. We give them food, but no money. And they destroyed the garrison. And nobody did anything about it. That hasn't changed. That was 1990. Their leadership and doctrine hasn't changed. There's a reason they're getting their asses handed to them. Pardon my French.
Chuck, just to reinforce what you're saying, I recommend to everyone it's called One Soldier's War. Obviously, they didn't like it. It's written by a Russian soldier of the Chechen War, and what Chuck is saying is exactly what he saw, repeated in that era, and you see it now in Ukraine. They have not changed one bit. Abuse, substance abuse, and violent actions by NCOs against their soldiers. You can only imagine what it's like with conscripts and prisoners that are employed now.
There's statement culture, and I guess our Minister of National Defense is trying to write a culture war. What I'm interested in is Margaret Macmillan's Understanding War. I thought that was a good start, maybe for the great unwashed out there to get some introduction. What your opinion on that?
I have it in my car if anybody wants. I'm taking it to give it away. Literally, it's in the back seat of my car. So if you want to read the book and you don't want to pay for it, come out to the car and I'll give it to you. Good book, but I love Margaret Macmillan, great Canadian historian, fantastic writer. Her book really is written for people that have a lot less understanding of war and warfare than most people around this table. It's written for the average lay person. The influence that war has had on our cultures. I think if you're interested in what culture has in terms of impact on military forces, I would suggest that you read anything written by an American military professor called Williamson Murray. Williamson Murray, M-U-R-R-A-Y. And just Google his name, and not everything that he has is available for free online, but a lot of his journals, a lot of his articles, and he's published a bunch of books. And his specialty has been American military culture, and I quote him in this book, and I quote him in my next book as well. So he has a lot of really good things to say about the impact of culture on how armies and navies and air forces fight. And we still haven't absorbed that, I don't think. Is it quick before I go over it?
I was just going to say for the great unwashed, what I got familiar with Ernest Hemingway's On War. And just before the Second World War was breaking out, his sons came to him and said, "What do we need about war?" And he put together a wonderful anthology from different anthology excerpts from the Bible, other writers, Red Badge of Courage, but he's organized it under Clausewitz's Principles of War. Okay. And it's very entertaining, and again, you might not want to hand a friend, something on a serious note, but it is interesting. It's very thick, I must say, but it's another interesting. Ernest Hemingway sort of gave his sons sort of a sense of what war was about.
Thank you.
A few nights ago, I had the pleasure of watching an exceedingly good video on the Polish unit in the RAF.
Oh, yeah.
And their incredible effectiveness.
Yep.
And the first 7 kills they knocked down ME-109s with Hurricanes. Now, the Hurricanes were designed specifically for attacking bombers, but they took out fighters, and they didn't lose anybody. They were incredibly good. They had a totally different philosophy on how to fight a battle in the air from the Brits. And the Brits eventually, to their credit, learned that maybe these Polish officers were not wrong. They got in close. When they pressed the button to fire some ammunition, it was going into an airplane. And it's an incredibly interesting hour, and I recommend it to anybody that needs a little clearer vision on how things need to change.
Thank you for that.
In that regard, there's a wonderful book called Last Hope Island. It's written by an American woman. And Last Hope Island was what the Polish called the UK.
Oh, okay. Last Hope Island.
41, 42.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Much of the Polish experience was in that book. One of the delightful ones is that one of the destroyers that was maintaining contact with the German battleship Bismarck.
Right.
They put up a smoke screen, and suddenly this destroyer darted out the smoke screen and fired its pathetic little 4-inch gun against the Bismarck, and signaled to Bismarck, "We are Polish." That's their attitude.
Yeah.
Hopefully it hasn't changed.
Well, my friends asked me when Russia, first of all, they asked me, will Russia invade in February? And I said, it makes no sense. Why would they? They got 90% of what they wanted already, and then of course they invaded. So I was wrong. So I admitted that I was wrong immediately, and then I said, in the last year during COVID, I taught 3 different syndicates full of Ukrainian colonels, and the message I came away from them was they'd rather die than become Russian again. And I said, the Russians don't have a chance. This is, the day of the invasion, I said to all my friends, the Russians haven't got a chance because they don't want to die for their country, and the Ukrainians will. So.
Last question, please.
Sure.
Question. The diagram with your concentric rings, why was population before infrastructure? Is there a reason for that?
So I'm just going to put it back up.
Population before...
So population is less important than infrastructure. That's what he's saying, and that's borne out in all bombing campaigns, right? I mean, London was was destroyed. Dresden was destroyed. I spent 2 years in Hamburg. My American friend and I called the bombing campaign the Allies' urban renovation program. 95% of the city that I lived in was not there anymore in 1945. They rebuilt it from scratch. And yet they didn't surrender, right? Berlin was destroyed, and they still didn't surrender. So, getting rid of the military is less important than getting rid of the population, is less important than getting rid of infrastructure. This is according to Warden, not me, right? The most important thing, according to Warden, is knock out their leadership, which is consonant with what JFC Fuller said, brain warfare. Use tanks to kill the headquarters. Without a headquarters, troops will stop fighting.
But in Ukraine, the Russians are doing the population first. Now they're doing the infrastructure.
That's because they're idiots.
Yes, I realize that.
Yeah. Well, they probably, I don't know, but I'm willing to bet that most of the Ukrainian or most of the Russian generals have never even heard of John Warden. I think we're done.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chuck. That was excellent. Thank you very much.